South Korea has removed Japan from its list of trusted trading partners. On August 12th, South Korea's Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy has unveiled a new plan to downgrade Japan from its list of trusted trading partners. The ministry said it would expand its export list into 3 groups of trading partners from the current 2, placing Tokyo in the newly established bracket called Group A2.
국제 수출 통제 원칙에 맞지 않게 수출 통제 제도를 운영하는 국가가 포함될 것입니다. 근본 고시 개정안에는 일본이 가해 2 지역으로 분류됩니다.
South Korea's latest measure was put in place to retaliate Japan's trade curbs. Seoul has decided to revise its whitelist as Tokyo continued to stay unresponsive to Seoul's consistent message for dialogue. The tit-for-tat whitelist measures continue to escalate tensions between Seoul and Tokyo. It is to be seen how adverse the move would affect the trade row.
Hello, welcome to The Point. I'm your host, Daniel Che. South Korea is revising its whitelist, meaning stricter inspections on outbound shipments to Japan. So how will this measure alter the ongoing course of the dispute between the two sides? We have a panel of experts from inside and outside of the nation to provide us with some valuable insights on the matter. So let's get to the point. To help us dissect today's topic into digestible bites, we're joined in the studio by Professor Choi Sang-mi from Ewha Women's University. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first of all, South Korea has announced on September 18th to strip Japan from its whitelist, a response measure against a similar move by Tokyo. What's your take on this strategy?
As you know, that last month, the Ministry of the Trade, Industry and Energy already announced that they are considering, dropping off Japan from our whitelist. So it's a kind of, planned procedure to respond to Japan's decision made last July. If you look at the situation itself, it's like, Japan and Korea, 2 giant countries in trade world in Asia, they are locked in trade, not just the trade disputes, it's kind of trade war. So.
Right. Other subjects are intertwined with this trade wars, which is what makes it more complicated. If you look at the chart we have prepared, the whitelist removal means stricter export regulations, and there are some changes that's going to take place after the whitelist removal takes place. What are your personal noteworthy changes based on the chart we have?
Yeah, if you look at the table, there is newly classified class, which is A-2. So it's not was there before. So because of decision, our governments created newly. If you look at the difference between the newly classified class and the class B, there is not much differences, which means that Japan is treated as like the Group B. So if any strategic product exported to Japan, the company must go through a lot of investigation to prove that the exported product not going to be used for military purpose or the security industry. So also if you compare the length of period to get the permission, if A area, it will take less than 5 days. However, if it belongs to A-1, then it will take more than 15 days. So longer time, more paperwork. That is the main changes.
Right, because time is money after all. And from Japan's perspective, when they noticed subtle changes, to the naked eye, it doesn't seem like much, but to them, it might be changes that could cost them dollars and yen.
So if you look at these changes, in a short time, there will be no big, negative effect on Japan's economies. But if you look at the longer period of time, if we describe that effect in terms of GDP, there's a research that it's going to hurt like 1.8% of total GDP in Japan's total economy. So that's a huge amount of negative impact on Japan economy as well.
So now it's complicated and difficult for both sides, both South Korea and Japan. Would the impact be immediate, and what kind of impact can we expect once the whitelist revision is implemented?
I mean, for Japan perspective, if you look at the semiconductor things, Japan of course need to import the semiconductor chips or things from Korea. But if you look at Japan's position, they regard it like they are not very depends on our product. However, our economies are linked to each other because the Korea, for a long time, we imported a very important part from Japan, and Japan also imported such a part from Korea as an exchange relationship. So it's going to hurt. Yeah, definitely.
Right. It's going to affect South Korean exporters as well. We've heard about how Japan, some of the companies are responding negatively to their own whitelist removal. Is the South Korean government planning to provide some safeguards to local firms that are affected by this whitelist revision of Seoul?
Of course, the government has a position that we want to protect that Korean company, even though they changes this export control system. So what they want to do is, even though the single private firms want to export our goods to Japan, they want to do their, and government's going to do best to reduce the time of, time to get the permission and provide the best service, not to be delayed when they export a product from Korea to Japan.
So the government will take some necessary measures to provide ways to cushion the blow to local firms.
Yes.
Going back to Japan in the political realm, they had a cabinet reshuffle recently, but it looks like some of the faces or figures, they are what many would call diplomatic hardliners. Does it equate to planning additional measures against Seoul?
It could be, because if some party, because it's kind of trade war, if one party did not provide a gesture that they want to reconcile this situation, then both sides were gonna finger pointing each other, and then they're gonna apply more measures, such as like the limitation of visa issuing and financial sanctions for a Korean firm, because we have a large amount of debts from Japan. And also they can play like more the public opinion in terms of world trade society. So these kind of things are what they can react, respond to our government's decision.
It's a unique situation of hurting each other in some sense.
A lot, yeah.
Well, let's extend our conversation to other experts now. It's time for an outside perspective looking into the back and forth whitelist measures. We have an economic expert checking in from Singapore via Skype for an in-depth discussion. Wakas Adenwala, he's the Asia analyst for the Economist Intelligence Unit. Welcome to our program, Wakas.
Okay, sure. Thank you for having me today on your channel, Arirang.
Well, thank you for being here with us. Well, Seoul is removing Tokyo from its list of trusted trading partners. How do you assess this particular move?
As you know, obviously, Japan was the first one to remove South Korea from its own whitelist of trading partners. So technically, South Korea's move is a reciprocal action against what Japan did a few weeks ago. And obviously, neither country is obviously going towards the benefit of trading actions in their own right. So obviously, something that's a worrying problem for all trading countries in the region.
Wakas, how would the exchange of trade measures by two giant Asian countries going to affect other countries? If so, what do you think about the particular industry going to affect it a lot from this exchange itself?
So obviously, South Korea and Japan are both major trading countries in the entire world. Their economies are quite big. They're both part of G20. They're also big producers of consumer electronic goods. South Korea obviously is a leading semiconductor producer. They both have very big automobile industries too. So obviously, the trade row has expanded from just Japan's restrictions on semiconductor exports to a lot of other sectors too, roughly 1,100 goods that South Korea imposed from Japan. it obviously has a very significant potential to overflow into trading supply chains for a lot of other countries too, specifically in the tech sector. So obviously, if you're looking at just semiconductors, products produced by South Korea are exported all over the world, such as China, Taiwan, US, and even back to Japan for companies such as Sony, which import those semiconductor devices from South Korea. So the ripple effects from these trades passed between South Korea and Japan can be quite big.
All right, thank you, Wakas, for your expertise on the matter. We appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, Ian. Have a good day.
Thank you. South Korea is lodging a WTO complaint over Japan's trade curbs. Here's a clip that explains why Seoul is taking the action and how it could affect the bilateral conflict.
Amid a trade dispute with Japan, South Korea announced on September 11th that it would lodge a WTO complaint over Japan's trade curbs.
이에 정부는 우리나라의 이익을 보호하고 정치적 목적으로 교역을 악용하는 행위가 반복되지 않도록 일본의 조치를 WTO에 제소하기로 하였습니다.
The lawsuit is against Tokyo's implementation of export restrictions on 3 strategic materials since July 4th. South Korea stressed Japan had placed the curbs to retaliate against its Supreme Court ruling. Japan is alleging South Korea is violating the 1965 treaty. But Seoul has stressed several times that its Supreme Court ruling was based on individual claims that the pact failed to cover. Japan, on the other hand, is sticking to its stance, stressing its trade measures do not violate WTO regulations.
我が国としては WTO 違反ということはその指摘は全く当たらないこういう認識でおりますから日本の立場をしっかりと粛々とこれからも発信をしていきたいこのように考えているわけでございます。
But South Korea specifically pointed out Japan's measures violate Articles 1, 10 and 11 of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. With South Korea and Japan set to engage in a series of talks on the lawsuit expected to be handled internationally, the bilateral tensions between the two sides are further escalating.
So, 69 days after Japan's export curbs, Korea decided to take this matter to the WTO, and of course, the legal procedure is expected to take a long time.
Yes. Usually it takes years to get result on our hand. But, if you look at that, the WTO complaints history between Korea and Japan, we had a very big winning couple of times in the past, like in 2004, there was the Japan actually did a quota, impose a quota on our seaweed export to the Japan, and also 2009. Japan imposed a huge tariff on our semiconductor export to the Japan at the time, and until Fukushima seafood banning import of Fukushima seafood to Korea. All these 3 cases we got winning through that WTO complaint. So I believe that our government has some know-how how we can win in this kind of the battle in terms of trade disputes. And plus, if you look at the other side, because as you said, it's going to take a long time to resolve this situation using WTO complaint means. If you look at strategic side, by filing WTO complaints regarding this whitelist removing things, that the other countries, in terms of trade society, World Trade Society gets to know how Japan did unprefer the decision going to hurt WTO commitments and the commitments of trade, free trade.
So regardless of the outcome, in terms of optics, it's not positive for Japan in this case.
I think so, yeah.
Right, we have to cover all corners, be prepared for any contingencies, any possible curveballs Japan could throw, and of course the impact and repercussions of our own decisions if we choose to stick with it. And now South Korea filed a complaint against Japan only for restricting export strategic items instead of the whitelist removal. So why is that so?
If you look at the removal itself, it's just, regarded as changing the system. So the file complaint, WTO complaint, is important to prove that our trading itself hurt a lot by the decision or their behavior or their measure adding, from this beginning. So because the system change has not led to actual negative impacts on our trade. However, those three things provide very, obvious evidence that it actually curve our, import as well as industry export to other country as well. So that's why I think.
Right. I think it's time for us to take another Skype interview with a few experts now. So we will be able to take this issue with the two foreign legal experts that's joining us from the U.S. and Hong Kong. Joel Treshman, Professor of International Law at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and Brian Mercurio, Professor of the Chinese University of Hong Kong. They are joining us via Skype right now. Hello, gentlemen.
Oh, thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for making time for us. First question for you, Professor Treshman. South Korea decided to file a WTO complaint against Japan. Do you agree with Seoul's stance that Tokyo violated tariffs and trade regulations?
The Korean complaint against Japan is that Japan is denying bulk licenses and imposing other administrative burdens with respect to three kinds of chemicals that are used in smartphones and TV displays and semiconductors. And those burdens, that denial of bulk licenses, might violate the WTO General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade requirement for most favored nation non-discrimination. So if Japan is treating other countries better than it's treating Korea, it might be violating that Article 1. And that's one of the things that Korea has claimed. Presumably the rationale is national security, and there's a special exception in GATT, in Article 21 of GATT, for measures that are justified for national security reasons. But they have to be necessary to protect the state's essential security interests, and those are usually very strong security interests. And I'm not sure that this satisfies that. And it also has to be a position that's taken in good faith, and in good faith relating to security. And so if Japan is taking this action for purposes of retaliating against South Korea, because of the comfort women issue, then it probably is not good faith as a security-based measure. So it may not qualify for that security exception. And so I think it may be that a WTO panel would decide that Japan is violating WTO law and does not qualify for that security exception.
And turning to you, Professor Mercurio, Japan's export curbs justification, security reasons. The only time the WTO allowed a nation to use trade measures for safety purpose was a case between Russia and Ukraine. Based on such track records, what are Tokyo's chances?
Yes, it's a good question. When a WTO complainant has made out its case and proven that there's a violation of the norms and standard, the respondent, in this case Japan, can raise a defense. And here the defense which Japan will rely upon is Article 21. And Article 21 is the national security defense. This clause has laid dormant for decades. It has not been tested until recently in a WTO panel. It rose to prominence really in the last few years with Donald Trump in the United States referring to the provision when it took safeguard measures against steel and aluminium. Now, our recent WTO case is a panel decision. It was not appealed to the appellate body, but it was a very distinguished panel probably intentionally so, because the WTO recognized the importance of this case, where Russia relied on the national security exception in a defense and a claim brought by the Ukraine. Now, Russia claimed and was backed by the United States that Article 21 is self-judging. That is, that a panel does not have the authority to rule upon it, and if a respondent raises a national security exception, it must be accepted. Now, the panel took a different view. The panel looked at the language, in particular of Article 21b(3), which states that a member may take action which it considers necessary for the protection of security interests, essential security interests, taken in times of war or other emergency relations. And the debate there became, what is an other emergency relation? And the panel held that there was a standard. All right? It said simple political or economic differences will not suffice. There needs to be a case of armed conflict, for instance, heightened tensions or crisis, or general instability. And to be fair, I think if Japan can prove that there is diversion or risk of diversion of chemicals which can be used in the manufacture of weapons, that it would have a case of a legitimate justification. So really, it's fact-dependent. I can't give an answer right now whether Japan's use of the national security exception is legitimate, because I think it's really dependent on the facts of the case. Is there a real risk of diversion? Were there problems with Korea's regime? What are those problems? Has there been cases of diversion? If Japan can prove with solid evidence that there is a risk, or there have been chemicals that have been diverted to North Korea, then I think their case for a national security exception becomes stronger, because, of course, not only do we know the tensions between North Korea and South Korea, but also I think North Korea is a legitimate threat to Japan. So again, the case becomes stronger, but we'll have to wait and see what evidence is put forward to support the claim.
Professor Trachman, as you know, the Korea has won the most of WTO dispute case with Japan. So how do you predict that a ruling with a specific lawsuit?
Well, it really depends on the way that the panel and maybe an appellate body would look at it. As you may know, the United States has not been agreeing to the appointment of new appellate body members, so the appellate body will stop working in December. So this case, which South Korea has brought against Japan, may not continue to the end where South Korea would be authorized to retaliate. So the precedent of who has won in the past doesn't really tell us who will win in a particular case. I think that if this case is pursued, it's probably more likely that South Korea would win, but it will take a couple of years at least to finish, and it may never finish unless the appellate body is continued.
Our final question is for Professor Mercurio. What about you? How do you expect this lawsuit to turn out?
Yes, again, I think that in this case, we'll have to wait and see what evidence is put forward. Now, Korea has taken really what I would call a shotgun approach to its claims. It has filed over 10 different claims involving 5 different agreements. Now, in the WTO, all you need is one to be successful to win the case. As I mentioned, I think that Korea's strongest claims are on the GATT, Article 1, Most Favored Nation, and Article 10, talking about the restrictions on exports. Its claims relating to the TRIMs, the Trade Facilitation Agreement, the Intellectual Property Agreement, and the Services Agreement are probably less likely to succeed. And that would mean that the case would hinge upon Japan's defense. And again, it's difficult to predict the likelihood of that without seeing the evidence that Japan is putting forward. if Japan can prove that there is a legitimate risk of diversion of these chemicals to North Korea and that the chemicals can be used to make weapons, or if it can demonstrate that actual diversion has taken place, its claim under Article 21 B3 is a lot stronger. I think in that case, their exception would be deemed to be legitimate, and they would ultimately win the case. So really, like with most WTO cases, it's fact dependent, and we'll have to take a wait and see approach before we can pass judgment on the merits of Japan's defense.
Professor Teichmann, Professor Mercurio, thank you so much for your insights and your time on this matter. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks again for having me.
Well, final question before we let you go, Professor Che. What are your thoughts on the future of this ongoing trade spat between the two Asian giants?
Because both of countries now are try to using tit-for-tat strategy. So if one of the party does not show any compromise gesture at first, it will be very hard to finish this war in a short time. So if we apply like a game theory, cooperation gonna bring the most beneficial result for both of us. But because there is no communication at all, so that's why we have to compete each other. So if we compete like this for a long time, definitely both of countries gonna hurt a lot. Because of that, maybe the other country get the benefit we are losing. So.
Right. Communication and a willingness to take a step back and let the other party talk and listen seems to be the key here. Mm-hmm. Well, this is where we have to wrap things up, Professor Che Sang-mi. Thank you so much for coming in and making our program complete today.
Thank you again.
Thank you. And as Professor Che said, it is important for two sides to be able to run into each other, and it looks like there might be more opportunities for that to happen with the APEC and ASEAN summits lined up. Hopefully, they'll be able to find some middle ground. Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back with more next week, same time. Do join us again. Thank you for watching.